Very nice to have an expectant silence. So welcome everyone to Wolfson College for this year's Syme Lecture. And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Catharine Edwards to Wolfson College. A few words about her background. After completing her PhD and then a junior research fellowship in Cambridge, she moved to Bristol University in 1989. Spent 12 years there and then moved to Birkbeck College in the University of London, where she is now Professor of Classics and Ancient History. She's also a Fellow of the British Academy. Her work focuses on the cultural history of the Roman world, particularly Rome in the late Republic and early Principate. The complex literary strategies of Roman texts. She's worked particularly on the younger Seneca, on Ovid, and more recently Cicero, as we will discover later, are, she argues, an intrinsic part of that world's fabric. She's interested in the ways in which conceptions of gender and other aspects of personal and social identity operate through and are inflected by language. Another important strand in her research has been the reception of antiquity in later centuries, particularly the 19th, and how receptions of antiquity are implicated in strategies of cultural formation and self-construction. She's published on the reception of Rome in Gibbon, in Madame de Stael, T.B. Macaulay, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and in 19th century guidebooks. And she takes these ideas to a wider public as well. In 2013, she presented the three-part BBC series Mothers, Murderers and Mistresses, Empresses of Ancient Rome, and she's contributed to BBC Radio 4's In Our Time series on an extraordinarily wide variety of subjects, including Cleopatra, Roman Britain, Virgil's Aeneid, Tacitus, and the decadence of Rome, Pliny the Younger, the Augustan Age, and Marcus Aurelius. So tonight, she will talk to us about slavery, and especially the relationship between Cicero's experiences as a slaver and the figure of slavery in his political thinking. So, Catharine, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. Syme casts a spell. I have always found the mordant ironies of his prose irresistible, almost, and I feel truly honoured to be invited by the President and Fellows of Wolfson to give the Syme Lecture for 2025. Sir Ronald Syme, I should confess straight away, had little time for Cicero's writing. He championed instead the fractured archaism of Sallust and the beguiling elusiveness of Tacitus. Syme's judgments on prose style were entangled in his judgments on politics. The Cicero, who emerges from the pages of his 1939 classic, The Roman Revolution, is inconstant, deluded, and dogged by the guilty knowledge of his own inadequacy, to quote Syme. An entire chapter is devoted to a pretty merciless attack on Cicero's character. But in the latter decades of the 20th, and to a still greater degree in the 21st century, Cicero's writings have emerged from under the shadow of Syme's judgment, not to mention the disapproval, indeed contempt, of the hugely influential 19th century German historian Theodor Mommsen. Serious attention is now being paid not only to Cicero's speeches and letters, but also to his philosophy. As for Cicero's politics, still more recent has been the closer scrutiny of his complicity in the structures of oppression that sustained the patriarchal, imperialist, slaver society that was ancient Rome. In the 18th century, before he fell out of favour with Mommsen and co., Cicero was a comfortable part of the mental furniture of educated men in Britain and even some educated women. Ciceronian tags studied parliamentary speeches, guidance on etiquette and treatises on social, political, and theological issues. Ciceronian concepts, structures, and tropes were an inextricable part of educated discourse. It's no surprise, for instance, to find a quotation from Cicero as the epigraph of the history of Jamaica, or a general survey of the ancient and modern state of that island, published anonymously in 1774. The author's name, Edward Long, soon became public knowledge. He was a man whose wide-ranging intellectual interests included history and philosophy. The classical learning in which he had been immersed from his youth permeates his writing. As he observed in a letter of 1780 to his son, at that time a student in Cambridge, "I am partial to Cicero, for I cannot but esteem he is the most complete model of elegant writing among the Romans. His language so easy, yet so polished, and his periods so harmoniously turned. Catherine Hall's masterly 2024 book, Lucky Valley, offers a lucid analysis of the place of Long's project in the context of debates around slavery in Britain and beyond in the latter half of the 18th century. Long's considerable wealth derived from his ownership of Lucky Valley, a sugar plantation with a labour force numbering more than 300 enslaved men, women, and children. Back in England, after many years in Jamaica, Long was outraged by the Somerset judgment of 1772, which prevented an enslaver from forcibly returning a slave to Jamaica, and thereby challenged the assumption that enslaved people were no more than property. More generally, Long was concerned at the growing prominence of anti-slavery voices. In his 3-volume work, The History of Jamaica, he sought to make the case for colonial slavery as essential to British wealth and power. As Hall makes clear, Long's project reveals a great deal about the workings of racial capitalism in its Atlantic form, giving, in her words, a remarkable picture of the racialization of a mid-18th century mercantile capitalist system. Long was concerned not only to justify the use of enslaved black workers, but also to remedy what he regarded as abuses in the system of government in Jamaica. The Ciceronian sentiment Long chose as an epigraph seems one of unimpeachable self-deprecation. What I have all along felt and wished about the case is just this. I would rather that any suitable person undertook the case instead of me, but I would prefer myself to nobody at all. Those familiar with Cicero might, of course, suspect Long of having, like Cicero, a well-developed sense of his own merit, scarcely concealed beneath this epigraph's parade of modesty. In Caecilium, the text from which Hall's epigraph is drawn served as prologue to Cicero's hugely successful and influential sequence of speeches for the prosecution in the case of Gaius Verres, indicted on a charge of provincial maladministration in 70 BCE, following his 3-year term as governor of Sicily. Cicero's speeches hit his mark, as Long was aware. Verres fled. To quote Long, the Romans, the most generous of all conquerors, instituted a means for punishing extortion committed by their praetors or other officers in their several states. End quotation. He drew a contrast between what he saw as the Romans' strict oversight of the behaviour of their provincial governors and the license allowed in his own day, when the mother state, he, in his words, made no attempt to limit governors' insolence of office, as he described it. Governors ruled like tyrants over the colonists under their authority. Long was, however, alert to criticisms that might be levelled at his own position. To quote him again, when the planters have complained of violations done to their own liberty, the enemies of the West India Islands have often retorted upon them the impropriety of their clamouring with so much vehemence for what they deny to so many thousand Negroes whom they hold in bondage. Give freedom, say they, to others before you claim it for yourselves. End of quotation. For long, however, there was no contradiction here. One might, after all, point to the glowing examples of the Romans and the Athenians. To quote Long again, no people were ever more jealous of their own liberty, yet they did not find their own enjoyment of liberty at all incompatible with the exploitation of others. The servant of a free man, Long suggested, optimistically, we might think, is more likely to receive mild treatment than the servant of an enslaved person. A darker view of this relationship may be found in the 20th century analyses of, for instance, Moses Finley, who in relation to classical Athens suggested a disturbing negative correlation between the political freedom of the citizen on the one hand and the profound subjection of the enslaved on the other, when he wrote of the advance hand-in-hand of freedom and slavery. Orlando Patterson's hugely important study a few years later, Slavery and Social Death of 1982, proposed a necessary relationship between slavery and Western notions of freedom. This is something scholars have continued to develop. The relationship, it should be said, has been perhaps nuanced in more recent studies of Greco-Roman societies. For instance, Kyle Harper and Walter Scheidel's essay on Rome, in Noel Lenski and Catherine Cameron's recent collection, What is a Slave Society of 2018. Yet, if we examine the ways in which the concept of slavery operates in, for instance, the writings of Cicero, my concern this evening, we might well feel that the argument Long puts in the mouths of his critics is one which could also be levelled at the Romans, and indeed Greeks, with whose writings he was so familiar. It's certainly striking that definitions of freedom in the political thought of, for instance, 17th century Britain frequently invoke a state of slavery as the antithesis of civic liberty. The work of Quentin Skinner and others has analysed brilliantly the ways in which these discussions of political freedom are indebted to the conceptualisation of freedom in Roman law and in the works of Roman writers such as Sallust, Livy, and Tacitus. Mary Nyquist's recent study of 2013 stresses the relationship of this discourse to classical Greek as well as Roman formulations, but she is also concerned to track the interrelationship between the discourse of political freedom in the 17th century and the practices of enslavement, particularly in the Atlantic world at that time, a subject which has received relatively little attention from modern historians of 17th century political thought. This neglect of the relationship between ideas of political freedom and servitude on the one hand and the institution of slavery on the other is, I would like to argue, also characteristic, though with some notable exceptions, of studies of ancient Roman political discourse. The extent to which the Roman economy and Roman society of Cicero's time relied on slave labour is an issue which remains disputed. Estimates of the number of slaves within Roman Italy vary enormously, perhaps 15 to 25% of the total population on a conservative reckoning. But it's absolutely clear that some sectors of the Roman economy were heavily dependent on slaves and that the households of the wealthy could not have functioned without them. Indeed, owning slaves, and the kind of slaves one owned, was a considerable source of personal prestige, as well as convenience and comfort. It's also evident that the huge number of slaves in Roman Italy was both a consequence and, to some extent, a driver of Roman imperial expansion. Individual Roman generals posted to frontier regions were strongly motivated to initiate military campaigns. Victory itself brought a special kind of prestige to a commander. It also brought very considerable personal profit for individual generals above all, but also for their officers and men, with a share going to the Roman state. Some conquered regions offered particularly rich pickings in captured gold. In others, Romans hoped for valuable human prizes. Vast numbers of individuals were enslaved after being captured as prisoners of war in Rome's military campaigns, a practice which seems to be well established as early as 400 BC. The price paid by Romans for slaves, conquest also brought wealth, was also a significant incentive to people traffickers in zones beyond the empire's frontiers, as Lisa Fentress shows in her article. This process reached a peak with the phenomenally successful conquests of Pompey in the east in the 60s and Julius Caesar in the west in the 50s. By the mid-50s BCE, Roman political life had come to be dominated by a pact between three extraordinarily powerful individuals, the great generals Caesar and Pompey, and the plutocrat Crassus. Pompey and Crassus were shoo-ins for the consulship, Rome's highest political office, of 55 BCE. From 58, Caesar had held an highly unorthodox extended command in Gaul. In spring 56, he was confirmed in his post for an additional period and with extra resources at his disposal. He set about expanding further the area ruled by Rome and further building up his own finances. Caesar was a terrifyingly brilliant and hugely charismatic general, winning a succession of major victories. By 52 BCE, according to Plutarch at any rate, he'd enslaved 1 million people and left 1 million dead, as he took over virtually all of what is now France and Belgium. The scale of the human traffic back to Rome is hard to imagine. In his political treatise on the Republic, De Re Publica, composed in the mid-50s, while Caesar was in the process of conquering Gaul, Cicero has one of the characters, Philus, acknowledge that in ruling their empire, Romans are imposing slavery of a more general kind over other peoples. Wisdom, or we could translate it shrewdness, urges us to increase our resources, to multiply our wealth, to extend our boundaries, he says. For what is the meaning of those words of praise inscribed on the monuments of our greatest generals? He extended the boundaries of the empire, except that an addition was made out of the territory of others. Wisdom, or shrewdness, urges us also to rule over as many subjects as possible, to enjoy pleasures, to become rich, to be rulers and masters. And the Latin verb dominare is obviously cognate with the noun dominus, whose primary meaning in the Oxford Latin Dictionary is the master of a household of slaves. The first entry in the Oxford Latin Dictionary refers specifically to a slave worthy of his master, domino. This section of the De Re Publica is sadly fragmentary. It's likely the case that Philus was explicitly adopting the role of devil's advocate in offering these comments on the nature of the Roman Empire. Certainly, as Malcolm Schofield has underlined, arguing against the interpretation of Peter Garnsey and more recently Miles Laverne, there are no good grounds for supposing that his interlocutor Laelius, the speaker who is accorded greatest authority in this section of the dialogue, concedes that Rome has enslaved even some provinces. Rather, Laelius goes on to underline the beneficent nature of Roman imperialism. All the same, I think we can infer that at least some people did choose to describe Rome's relationship with its subject peoples as one of enslavement. Indeed, 10 years previously, in one of his speeches against Catiline, Cicero spoke of some of those defeated by Rome as being crushed into servitude, oppressi serviunt. And a few years after writing De Re Publica too, he can be found characterizing the relationship in exactly these terms. It is against divine law for the Roman people to be enslaved, since the immortal gods willed that they rule over other nations. While the verb imperare in some contexts can cover a more familial form of relationship, such as that of father to children, here we must, I think, clearly understand it as the converse of servire. Julius Caesar was a formidable general. He was also supremely skilled at communication. Absent from Rome for years at a time during his campaigning, he kept himself in the public eye by circulating an account of his conquests. His Gallic War in limpidly clear Latin. Caesar, writing about the Gauls, against whom he was marshalling his troops, acknowledged his enemies' understandable desire to resist, to fight for freedom. It's human nature to desire freedom and to hate the condition of slavery, writes Caesar. The bravery and spirit of Gauls made them worthy enemies for his Roman legions, but they would ultimately be defeated and huge numbers of them would be enslaved, as we saw. Would this have counted as a just war as Cicero defined the concept in a now fragmentary section of the De Republica, as well as in his later treatise, De Officiis, on duties. At any rate, in December 54 BCE, Cicero wrote to his brother Quintus, then serving as an officer under Caesar's command in Gaul. He was very glad to hear that his brother had secured some slaves to staff his own properties. Thank you very much for your promise of slaves, mancipii. As you say, I am indeed understaffed both in Rome and on my estates. We never learn the names of these individuals or indeed anything more about them. Sorry. Cicero, in common with the rest of the authors whose works survive from the Greco-Roman world, never wrote a treatise on slavery. In that sense, my title is an allusion to that. Nowhere did he set out to offer an explicit defense of slavery as an institution. Yet slavery as an idea crops up often across the range of his writing, in his political philosophy, in his speeches, and in his letters. In his treatise on the Republic, in a passage with significant Aristotelian resonances, he analyzes different power relationships. The rule of the mind over the body is compared to the rule of a government over its citizens. But over lust, it is asserted, the mind rules as a master rules his slaves, restraining it and breaking its power. Libidini autem aut servis dominus quod eam coercet et frangit. The implication that slaves need to be broken is a chilling one. The term frangery, we might note, is frequently associated with emasculation. We'll come back to that later. There is some debate about the extent of Cicero's familiarity with Aristotle's ideas, but it's clear that Cicero's formulation, as Jean-Christian Dumont underlines, inverts the account to be found in Aristotle. Aristotle in the Politics compares the rule of a king over his subjects to that of reason over the passions, while the rule of a master over his slaves is compared to that of the mind over the body. Certainly, Cicero's handling of the master-slave relationship underlines its coercive character, but in acknowledging that the slave has a will, it also perhaps avoids the dehumanization of the slave, which is a feature of Aristotle's account. So, what did go on in Cicero's households? He was, after all, the owner of a large number of enslaved persons. Some tilled the fields or tended the animals on his country estates. Others stoked the furnace in his bathhouse or made bread in his kitchen. Many of these roles would be replicated across his numerous establishments. Others still attended Cicero's person, organizing his clothes, emptying his chamber pot, shaving him. Out and about, he would always be accompanied by slave attendants. His writings, even his letters, are largely silent on these people and his relations with them, though Susan Trujillo has written about Cicero's freedmen as can be disentangled from the letters. And yet, in the middle and latter years of the 50s BCE, slavery was increasingly on Cicero's mind. Frequently, however, when the term slave crops up, it is applied not to the persons who attended to his every physical need and whom he regarded as his property, though we shall come back to those people shortly. Rather, it is Cicero and his fellow members of Rome's political elite who are so described. In the spring of 56 BCE, Cicero was still weakened politically. In 58, outmaneuvered by his political opponents, he'd spent 16 months in exile, returning in September 57. Once, he'd been a sharp critic of Julius Caesar's activities, at least intermittently. Now, he was under pressure to leave off such interventions. Prompted by Pompey, whose cooperation had played a key role in enabling his return to Rome, Cicero offered outspoken support for key features of the Gang of Threes arrangements, including the extension of Caesar's command in Gaul. Writing to his old friend Atticus in April 55, he berated himself explicitly for facilitating what he characterized as a state of slavery under this what is often called by modern scholars triumvirate, the Gang of Three. You share only in the slavery that's common to us all. But I, who if I speak as I ought on public matters am thought mad, if I say what expediency demands appear a slave, how am I to feel? How should we understand servitus here? Most obviously as the loss of freedom, libertas. In many respects, these two terms are for Cicero mutually constitutive. The nuances of libertas, a buzzword often and variously invoked in Roman politics, have of course been brilliantly explored in recent years by Valentina Arena. In the late Republic, as Arena underlines, libertas was widely, if not universally understood, as a state of non-domination. One character in Cicero's political treatise De Republica specifically associates one-man rule with the loss of libertas. A people that is subjected to a king lacks many things, most importantly, libertas, which resides in not experiencing our master, dominus, as just, but as in having no master. Libertas is a state of non-domination. This passage has played a key role in more recent debates about positive and negative conceptions of freedom, debates in which Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit have played a leading role. But going back to Cicero, in his writings, Rome itself is a place that excels all other states in freedom, as he asserts in his political speeches as well as in his political philosophy. Cicero's emotive characterization in his letter to Atticus of 55 BCE treats political liberty as analogous to juridical liberty. The loss of political liberty thus involves falling into a state of servitude. His lament at his own enslavement here highlights in particular the association between freedom and speech that is unconstrained, uncensored. Elite Romans set a high value on the freedom to express one's opinion, even if, as Arena has underlined, this was not a right enshrined in law. In his role as ex-consul, he'd served as consul back in 63, Cicero's eloquence equipped him preeminently to give voice to, on his own view, reasoned political judgments and make a contribution to political debate. Now, however, fear muzzled legitimate critique. The Senate was no longer an arena for the frank exchange of views. The dominance of the Gang of Three thus effectively made slaves of their fellow citizens. Senators, indeed. The rule of the Gang of Three was eventually succeeded first by civil war and then by the dictatorship of Caesar. The one-man rule of Caesar was itself terminated by his assassination in 44 BCE. Cicero, in his treatise on duties, De Officiis, subsequently reflected on Caesar's dominance in similar terms to those he'd used in that letter to Atticus about the Gang of Three, years earlier. Here, indeed, in discussing political slavery and expressing disappointment in his fellow citizens' failure to resist Caesar, he draws an explicit comparison with slavery in the domestic sphere. But those who keep subjects in check by force would, of course, have to employ severity, saivitia, or savagery, we might translate that. Masters, for example, towards their servants, when these cannot be held in control in any other way. But those who in a free state deliberately put themselves in a position to be feared are the maddest of the mad. Casually alluding to the savagery or saivitia with which domestic slaves are treated, Cicero makes a comparison between domestic and political slavery. But at least as far as Rome is concerned, he also disavows this comparison. Saivitia towards domestic slaves may be justifiable. The tyrant who makes himself an object of fear in what should be a free state has no excuse. Julius Caesar experienced the consequences. Cicero's choice of vocabulary, using famuli to refer to domestic slaves here, perhaps serves further to play down the parallel between literal enslavement and the political slavery he and his peers were experiencing, and yet it was a parallel he could not resist introducing. An anecdote Cicero includes in the following section of De Officiis is suggestive. Dionysius the Elder, who ruled Syracuse and Sicily in the early 4th century BCE, made himself so hated that he was in constant fear of his life. With what tormenting fears, writes Cicero, he used to be racked, for through fear of the barber's razor, he used to have his hair shaved with glowing coal. So when he needed a shave, Dionysius would not let a barber anywhere near his throat. In the De Officiis, the barber, whose blade Dionysius fears, is referred to only through the adjective applied to his razor, the kultros tonsurios. The status of the barber himself is here obscured. In the case of members of the Roman elite, shaving will surely have taken place for the most part within the home and at the hands of a slave. Commenting on this story, William Fitzgerald, in Slavery and the Roman Literary Imagination, observes, one might well believe that the experience of being shaved may perhaps give rise to horrible imaginings in the master. In De Officiis, then, we may perhaps see, albeit fleetingly, the vulnerability of the tyrant and the master elided, as, conversely, is the capacity of the aggrieved citizen to lay claim to freedom through violence elided with that of the aggrieved slave. How often did the master who used Cywitia to coerce his slaves fear the fate which befell Caesar? In the end, then, the tyrant Caesar had indeed been assassinated in the name of liberty, libertas. But as the months passed, Cicero was increasingly worried that the liberators were failing to capitalise on their valiant act. Instead, it seemed that Caesar's deputy, Mark Antony, was aspiring to take Caesar's place as autocrat. In a letter to Cassius, one of Caesar's killers, written in early October 44 BCE, Cicero reflected on the assassination and the rise of Antony in its aftermath. We could not tolerate a master, so we're in bondage to our fellow slave. Over the coming months, Cicero gave a series of impassioned speeches, his Philippics, attempting to rally his fellow Romans against what he presented as Mark Antony's attempt to establish his own form of one-man rule. The opposition between freedom and slavery runs through all of these speeches, as John Hall has well underlined. Antony's desire for personal dominance, his lack of concern for the rule of law, the ease with which he resorted to violence were deeply disturbing. This was a worse kind of slavery than that exercised by Julius Caesar, Cicero suggested to Cassius. In what sense worse? Caesar had habituated the Roman people to a kind of slavery, for sure, but Antony was a worse man, lacking Caesar's charisma, his insight, his potent intellect, and lacking his self-control. Antony, for all the power he had appropriated, remained himself a slave to the appetites of the flesh, libido. In the second Philippic, a pamphlet in the form of a speech, which Cicero circulated in the autumn of 44 BCE, he insisted at length and in colourful detail on the ways in which Antony was a slave to bodily pleasures. And he was a man with no capacity for self-rule. Cicero dredged up a story from years previously alleging that Antony had had a homosexual affair with another Roman elite man, Curio, a relationship in which Antony willingly played what the Romans regarded as a passive role. No slave boy bought to satisfy lust was ever so completely in his master's power as you were in Curio's, he fulminated. The lust here is implicitly Curio's, not Antony's, but this willingness to subordinate himself revealed Antony's slavish disposition. Such sexual passivity in an elite male was deeply shocking for Romans. And this was of a piece with Antony's later behaviour in offering the diadem to Caesar in the early months of 44 BCE. You should have petitioned for yourself alone, who had lived in such a fashion from boyhood that you were prepared to endure anything and happily accept servitude. Sorry, slightly too much Latin there. Early In 43 BCE, as Antony tried to take control of northern Italy by armed force, Cicero redoubled his efforts to rally the Senate against him. Since there is now the critical question before us whether he pays his penalty to the Republic or we become slaves by the immortal gods, members of the Senate, let us at last take our father's spirit and courage, resolving to regain the freedom that belongs to the Roman race and name, or else to prefer death to slavery. The rousing terms in which Cicero articulates this crisis are striking. Death is preferable to political slavery. His assertion associated the love of freedom with courage, virtus, which we could also translate as manliness, a key part of the civic virtue which marks a people as worthy of liberty. The tradition in ancient political thought of associating tyranny, rule by one man, with the enslavement of citizens was a long-established one. Yet it's worth asking, in the words of Mary Nyquist, why should exclusion from political participation or the perception that arbitrary decision-making has oppressive consequences be represented as precisely slavery? Focusing particularly on early modern political theorists such as Locke and Hobbes, Nyquist's arbitrary rule, slavery, tyranny, and the power of life and death offers a searing account of the ways in which references to slavery and freedom in the political realm are entangled in the imperialist projects of the Atlantic world more generally, and in the slave trade and its justifications more particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. An especially notable feature of Nyquist's project is her underlining of the degree to which this nexus of thought is indebted to features of Greek and Roman political discourse, as I noted earlier. Accusations of enslavement against a putative tyrant in this discourse implied a range of infringements against the citizen's liberty. The tyrant runs roughshod over publicly constituted laws. The metaphor of citizens as chattels also serves to underline the putative tyrant's claims to the fruits of citizens' labour, to their children, to their sexual ownership of wives and daughters, to their dignity, to their lives. One-man rule, dominatus, according to one speaker in Cicero's treatise on the Republic, always has the potential to deteriorate into a regime as cruel as that of the tyrant Phalaris. But this metaphor also, as Nyquist underlines, trivialises and occludes key features of chattel slavery as practiced in ancient Rome and elsewhere, notably the trauma of deracination and kinlessness, the humiliation associated with the ongoing instability of social identity, social death, as Orlando Patterson memorably described it. Cicero, like other Romans, invokes the figure of slavery to convey what he perceived to be a deeply humiliating power dynamic. Nyquist perceptively observes, the rhetoric of political slavery has layers of condensed, sedimented meanings and a range of affective registers. As she also notes, Roman anti-tyranny discourse distinguishes itself by a stinging stress on the shamefulness of voluntarily submitting to political servitude. It should be emphasised that as a political metaphor, enslavement has a very particular charge in a society where enslaved people are omnipresent, especially within the households of the wealthy. As Page Dubois observes in relation to the Greek language of political enslavement, such claims manipulate the fears and anxieties of the free Greeks by threatening them with the status of their chattels who were insistently, troublingly present, tattooed, bearing the scars of beatings and whippings, sexually vulnerable among the furnishings of everyday life. The identities of almost all of Cicero's slaves are unknown, but a small proportion of them were highly educated individuals who had charge of his accounts, tutored his children, or supported his own administrative and intellectual labours. These individuals are sometimes referred to by name. One among them is especially prominent. Included as part of the manuscript tradition of Cicero's collected correspondence to his friends ad familiares, a cluster of letters is addressed to or is about Cicero's secretary, Tiro. These offer unparalleled insight into the relationship between a Roman master and his slave. They're the letters which comprise Book 16 of the collection, a book described by Mary Beard as one of the most important texts on slavery to have survived from the ancient world. Oh, sorry. Cicero's letters convey his affection for and reliance on Tyro, even while they also subtly reinforce the status differential between them. When Tyro was ill in April 53 BCE, for instance, Cicero wrote solicitously. As Beard notes, Tyro's recovery becomes a duty that he owes his ex-master. Several thoughtful recent articles have focused on the multiple ways in which Cicero's own prolific writing was indebted to the almost invariably unacknowledged contributions of the enslaved people around him, and Ryan Warwick's article is a nice example of that. Tyro himself seems to have undertaken significant editorial work. In his case, at least, Cicero confesses something of his debt. When Tyro's illness confined him some distance away, Cicero declared, "My, or our, literary brainchildren have been drooping their heads, missing you." A visitor had been keen to hear his compositions, but, Cicero reported to Tyro, "I said that in your absence, my tongue of authorship is tied completely. Sine te omnia mea muta esse." We can, of course, only speculate about the precise extent of Tyro's contribution, perhaps even to the content of Cicero's writing. Cicero recognized Tyro's services by giving him his freedom in late spring 53 BCE. This was quite usual in the case of highly skilled slaves, but as often happened with freedmen, Tyro continued to work for Cicero for the rest of Cicero's life, and indeed is often thought to have been responsible for collecting and editing a significant part of his correspondence after his death. Book 16 of the Letters to Friends, the last in the collection as traditionally constituted, could then be seen as a kind of sphragus, alerting the reader to the editor's role. A letter from Cicero's brother Quintus, sent from Gaul when he was serving with Julius Caesar, congratulates Cicero on Tyro's manumission. Quintus was also fond of Tyro. Now he was to be a servus, no longer a slave, but a friend. Another letter from Quintus, this time addressed to Tyro himself and composed over a decade later in December 44 BCE, has been positioned by the editor, who may be Tyro, as the very last in this last book of Letters to Friends. At the end of the letter, Quintus looks forward to greeting Tyro in the Forum, an implicit reflection of Tyro's status as a free citizen of Rome. Yet the letter also alludes to the political crisis at that point engulfing the Roman Republic. Quintus writes of the ineptitude of the consuls appointed for the following year, 43 BCE. The weakness of these men means they are all too likely to fall under the spell of that bandit, latro, Mark Antony. At least we generally assume it's a reference to Mark Antony. As Beard observes of Quintus's letter, here we find the fate of the state mapped onto the fate of the slave, and Cicero himself figured as a man who could free his Tyro to rounds of applause, but was forced to look on while the state itself lost its liberty. To conclude, Edward Long, in the service of his retrograde project to protect his interests as a slave owner, articulated a particular perspective on the connection between power structures in the public and private spheres. As for Cicero's Rome, it's tempting to concur with Syme's wry observation in 1939. Libertas was most commonly invoked in defense of the existing order by individuals or classes in enjoyment of power and wealth. Yet we also need to recognize that the rhetoric of political freedom, key strand in the discourse of anti-tyranny Cicero so ably deployed in his speeches against Antony and elsewhere, was paradoxically made vivid and energized precisely by the omnipresence of the institution of chattel slavery. In his assertions that he and his fellow citizens were being threatened with slavery, Cicero himself both sees and does not see the parallels between situations of literal and of metaphorical enslavement. Tiro himself, if it was he who edited the letters, in placing this particular letter last, subtly juxtaposes the condition of the freed slave with that of the enslaved republic. The irony is one which even Syme might have appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just check, do we have a microphone available? So if there are any questions from the audience, the speaker would, I'm sure, be happy to take on some for a short while. So any questions or thoughts? Yes, Philip.
Thank you so much for this.
We have a microphone.
I can sit up. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. I found this really convincing. I just had a question about the letter in which Cicero tells Tiro, you've got to get better.
Yes.
Because I wondered if that idea that Tiro owes that to Cicero is a too literal reading of a way of expressing a wish for somebody to get better, in the way that in English as well we could say you've got to get better, and it's not so much you owe that to me, it's just showing that you really want the addressee to get better.
I take your point. I mean, I think one could well read it in that way. I mean, there are other letters in Book 16 where I think the language of slavery is closer to the surface, if you like, and in particular where it's really Quintus, Cicero's brother rather than Cicero himself, talks about giving Tiro a beating for not sending a letter, and that's a reference to the sort of vulnerability to physical punishment is really so closely associated with the state of slavery that it's hard not to read it as a kind of allusion to it.
Sure, thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts from members of the audience?
I have a rather naive question. What are the differences between slavery in late Republic Rome and slavery today?
Oh, okay, wow, that's a big question. I mean, there are, I suppose, a lot of different ways of defining slavery, and the collection, the 2018 collection I referred to, edited by Lenski and Cameron, kind of explores some of the ways of defining slavery. And I think one of the issues in the debate has been how far slavery is traditionally understood, where I suppose where one person is regarded as the property of another, how far that is a concept that is too much rooted in Western concepts of property, for instance, or whether a kind of a more flexible definition of slavery that refers to the extent to which an individual has, I suppose, control, has agency over aspects of their own life, subject to punishment, or how far they are separated from their family. There are a lot of different components, I guess, in how slavery might be defined. I suppose a very obvious difference in terms of Roman law and Roman society in the time of Cicero is that the slavery is absolutely normalized within a legal context. So it's not something that the law seeks to I suppose, challenge. And I mean, within British law, obviously, slavery is illegal, but slavery is something kind of outside the law. Whereas, in Roman law, it's absolutely embedded in the structures of the state. So, sorry, that's not a terribly coherent answer, but I mean, it is as I say, there's a lot of argument about exactly the best way to define slavery.
Thank you very much. That was an absolutely fascinating paper. I've got a question that comes from the back end of Book 5 of the Ad Familiares, which is Cicero writing to Vatinius in the 40s. And Vatinius is romping around in Bulgaria, carrying out various sort of semi-genocidal campaigns against locals, and continually writes to Cicero saying, I'm also on the trail of one of your fugitives, one of your ex-slaves who's run away to join the Bulgarian People's Front. And I'm going to get him back for you, and if you could keep, saying nice things about me, I'll continue to try and track this person down. And in the course of that correspondence, Vatinius gives away that the slave in question was a reader for Cicero, so somebody just had to read things out for him. And I suppose my question is, what is it that leads someone whose job is, as you say, not tilling fields, not a level of comfort in the actual job, just reading out for Cicero, would make them go and do something like that, to go and run away to Bulgaria and join, which may be a wonderful freedom-fighting organisation. But do you think we should imagine a low level of violence and horror in Cicero's household for someone whose job is reading for him that would lead you to do that, or whether the desire for freedom is such that would make someone throw in their lot with the Bulgarian People's Front rather than stay reading Cicero's letters for him, which we all agree are very nice letters to read?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. One of the many expert Ciceronians here tonight is making me feel I'm feeling rather daunted at speaking in front of these Cicero experts. Okay, why might someone who's got a relatively cushy slave job in Cicero's house run away? In a way, there's in terms of the recent debates around the evidence for slavery, and particularly the evidence for slavery in Cicero's letters, various scholars have criticised a kind of more old-fashioned sort of sentimentalist approach that says, actually, Cicero would have been a lovely master. He's clearly really nice to his slaves. I suppose I don't want to be too cynical in terms of Cicero and Tyro, who obviously got on well to some extent. We never have anything that Tyro writes. We don't really get his perspective. And similarly, it's Dionysius, isn't it, the guy who's run off. We have no idea what could have motivated him. Now, the politics within the household is something that's incredibly tantalizing. And there's this, I'm sure you know the amazing passage in Tacitus where a Roman senator has been murdered by one of his slaves, and it's a great scandal because, according to the law, all the slaves in the house have to be executed because they failed to intervene and prevent this terrible murder from happening. But one of the interesting moments is where Tacitus speculates as to what drove this slave to murder his master. Was it because the master had promised to free him and then went back on his promise? Or were they both in love with the same person within the household? The sort of politics of what goes on in the household is so difficult to get at, but that's a kind of really interesting moment where we get that sort of, so maybe Dionysius and Tyro hated each other, and they were forced to share a room, and Dionysius just found it unbearable. He was really annoyed to see Tyro constantly preferred him. We have no idea. Or maybe he'd fallen in love with someone who'd gone off to Bulgaria. There's all kinds of possible motivations, really. But it's very interesting that the harshness with which Dionysius gets treated and the way that Cicero talks about him. So, that's a kind of a rather darker side to, and I didn't have time to talk about that today, but that is a really interesting story. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you very much. One last question here.
Thank you, Professor. My question is, there are difference between the ancient liberty or freedom and the modern freedom and liberties. So as a modern person, how could we understand the liberty or freedom in Cicero's sense? Is it different, for example, for the ancient people? The liberty means freedom in police. But in modern, it's different. So how we can understand it in the Cicero sense? Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. Sorry, could I just ask you to repeat the bit about the freedom in Asia being, how would you define freedom in Asia?
I think it was ancient. It was ancient.
Ancient, yeah.
Sorry. Okay, sorry, ancient and modern liberty. Okay. Wow, that's a really big subject. All these kind of political philosophers kind of, write huge monographs on this. I think, the sort of positive and negative definitions of freedom are kind of two. In fact, Isaiah Berlin, it has an association.
This gentleman is a scholar of Isaiah Berlin.
Okay, yes, okay. So, yes, I mean, I think one of the kind of complicated aspects of defining freedom is how far one wants to see it as something in terms of the kind of external structures within which one lives, or how far is it something that is also perhaps internal to the individual, that and in terms of as Stoicism under the Roman emperors, we have this sort of increasing popularity of Stoic philosophy, that's also influential too in Cicero's day, and perhaps a sense that freedom is something that can be entirely internalized as long as you have a free spirit. It doesn't matter that you're a slave, because you can still be, philosophy has made you free. So that's a way of kind of separating the state of freedom versus slavery from the particular political conditions in which one lives completely.
Thank you very much. I think I will draw this session to a close. As an entire non-specialist, I find it absolutely fascinating, the link between the interior life of a family and the politics of an empire, and then leaping from one era to another through this lens of slavery. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much indeed. I should say, since this is the annual Syme Lecture, we also have a reception in the buttery afterwards for any one of you who would like to join us. Do please follow signs for the buttery and carry on the conversations there. But for the moment, may I say on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed.